Good evening, all of you, to another evening of a series of discussions that have been initiated by the Center for Urban Studies at the Mahatma Gandhi University School of International Relations and Politics. We've been working together with a budding ethnography collective that is coming from the Institute of Multidisciplinary Studies in Social Sciences, and the students have been uh, in the very keen to be part of such dialogues, and thus a series of discussions are already on. And today we are particularly happy to have with us Angela Glaros, and Angela has agreed to be our resource person uh, in this particular space of discussion that we've been having, with a very interesting theme, which goes right into her research interest in music, um, and then goes into the ongoing work on particularly about the Greek Orthodox musical tradition. And we also hope she will get into her upcoming domain of research on ethnography of food, with very interesting forays into such fields like autoethnography or phenomenological kinds of intakes into her fields of work. I'm sure Angela will add a lot more insight to this enthusiastic collective that we've been having here. So, without much delay, I request Angela to start her talk, and all of you can, after this discussion, feel free to engage in dialogues. And please take care when the talk is going on to keep the mics in the mute mode so that everyone could listen. So welcome to all of you. It's very happy to see so many people waiting to listen to this talk. So Angela, with much happiness, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and good evening to all of you. It's morning here for me, but I know it's evening there for you, and I'm thrilled to be able to speak with you today, and I look forward to hearing your questions. While I make my introductory remarks, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that I can show you my slides. Okay. All right. Hopefully that's visible.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm particularly delighted to talk to people who come from a variety of disciplines, because sometimes I can spend too much time stuck in conversations within my own discipline, and it becomes like an echo chamber. And I tried to take anthropology's possibilities seriously, that we are a discipline that has the potential anyway to engage with the world and to simultaneously better understand ourselves. So that's where I come from with anthropology. I'm going to say a little bit about the legacy of our discipline, which is mixed, let's put it that way. I want to say just a brief comment about these images that I've put on my introductory slide. They're meant to signal each of the different research projects that I'm going to talk about today. Three of my main ethnographic projects, one of them mostly in the past, one of them ongoing, and one of them emerging. So in the upper left corner, this image is a carnival masquerader from the Greek island of Skyros, and he's wearing a goat skin and the skin of a kid, a baby goat on his face, and then a lot of goat bells. So you might get the impression that they raise goats on Skyros, and of course they do. And so carnival, as I will discuss, was one of the interests that I had initially in approaching what ended up being my dissertation project because of the ritual and performance aspects of this annual tradition. And then the next picture over is a more recent one of me engaged in what has become an apprenticeship, a very long-standing apprenticeship in Greek Orthodox liturgical chant. So this is me in my home church in Champaign, Illinois, wearing a mask due to COVID and trying not to spread respiratory particles. And I will say a lot more about that and the place and the place making involved in where you stand, where you chant from. And I mean that literally and metaphorically. And then at the bottom is a little glimpse of the first food anthropology class that I taught when the students did a service project on our campus, helping with the composting program that they had established there. And so they were helping to get some compost buckets ready to collect from all of the dining halls on campus to try to combat food waste and close the circle. And I'll say more about that in just a moment. First, I wanted to think about a few of my theoretical and methodological, if you will, anchors for today's talk, things that help orient my ethnographic practice. And so I draw a lot on some of the scholars who have talked about and problematized so-called native anthropology, beginning with Kiran Narayan from 1993. And what I like about Narayan's work is that instead of trying to really reinforce the dichotomy between so-called native and so-called non-native anthropologists, she advocates that we think about every anthropologist in relation to their field work, as she says, quote, in terms of shifting identifications amid a field of interpenetrating communities and power relations, unquote. And she advocates for, quote, the enactment of hybridity, unquote, in ethnographic writing. So keeping in mind that as anthropologists or others who conduct ethnography, we are simultaneously scholars, but also everyday people in the world. And one reason why I think this is an important source is that she's finding a new way to address anthropology's longstanding colonial legacy. And that is a legacy that all of us have to grapple with when we call ourselves anthropologists, as I do. Those of us anthropologists who claim that ethnography is our particular invention, whether or not you agree with that, to the extent that we do practice ethnography from that framework, we have to grapple with this colonialist legacy, because that is the framework that has produced that fixed dichotomy between native and non-native, as if somehow one were subordinate to the other. And that is certainly how many anthropologists in our discipline's history have been positioned. If the intention of anthropology is to understand the other with a capital O, then we have to think clearly about our position relative to the community in which we study. And I think this idea of hybridity is very important. Expanding on this, I also like Wazir Karim's take on native anthropology, which refines this idea that, not only are we hybrid, we have to really think about where home is located. What are we native to? A lot of times the so-called native anthropologist has been described as one who does research in their own home. What does that mean? Is your home country really your home? We need to consider social location too, things like class, gender, levels of education. If the standard for native anthropology, which some would argue I have been doing, in some of my recent projects, we have to consider what might be the differences between myself as a researcher, as someone with a PhD, and someone with whom I'm interacting in my community that doesn't share that background. How native am I, in other words? I also particularly like Leila Abulugod's idea of Hafi anthropology. She is someone who is a Palestinian American, and so she embodied that Hafi identity, as do I, as a Greek American who has had grandparents, a grandparent from Greece, and then grandparents born in the United States. So Hafis, people whose, you see here in her definition, whose national or cultural identity is mixed by virtue of migration, overseas education, or parentage, are going to trouble that self-other dichotomy that our colonial legacy in anthropology has put so much energy into. Because when Hafis present the other, they're also presenting themselves. I'll give you an example of how this came up for me very early in my training. So while I was a doctoral student at the University of Illinois, I wrote a paper in a class related to Greek Orthodox Christianity, which happens to be my background. It's a community I'm active in, and now I'm doing research in. And my advisor at the time was quite critical of the paper because, as she described it, she saw me as and I quote, an apologist for Christianity. In other words, she felt somehow I could not be objective because I was a member of this community. And I found that ironic because anthropology has gone through what we might call a crisis of objectivity. Those of you who might have an anthropological background might know about the so-called postmodern turn in anthropology in the 1980s, when scholars became very concerned about representation. How do we represent cultures and communities that we study? Do we claim to be objective about them, or are we going to be aware that our knowledge is always situated? And that was a long and contentious debate, and some would say it hasn't really ended. I know of many senior anthropologists who almost mourn the loss of this idea of objectivity in their discipline, and really see that turn toward reflexivity, a concern with representation as a loss of scientific legitimacy. But I personally, like Leila Abulukod, and as a Hafi myself, and also as a feminist, I very much take her point that feminists and Hafis must always be aware of how our knowledge is situated and recognize the way in which knowledge is produced. We can't pretend that our knowledge is context free. And in fact, we, and I would argue that being aware of the context and how the knowledge is situated in power relations is in fact more objective, and therefore we may need to include ourselves in that context when talking about our ethnographic research. And then finally, addressing the concept of autoethnography, which is not necessarily a concept I have consciously used. I do find myself attracted to Carolyn Ellis's definition of autoethnography as, quote, research, writing, story, and method that connect the autobiographical and personal to the cultural, social, and political, unquote. And in this respect, her approach is really similar to something that came about several decades earlier in the work of British anthropologist David Pocock, who wrote about personal anthropology. And it's very similar. It's trying to connect your personal story to your wider social and cultural context. So in my classes, when I teach ethnographic methods to my undergraduate students, or when I teach my class on ethnography, we don't necessarily address autoethnography, but we do in fact work on the concept of personal anthropology and finding ways that a student's chosen research topic might connect to their personal story as an anchor. And I'm very much inspired by Carolyn Ellis's quote here. It's about giving insight into who you are and who others are, and finding a way to be in the world that works for you. And that last bit is the part that I am, for what remains of my career, really trying to embody, trying to find a way to be in the world that works for me, and not just for me, but for others around me. In other words, how can I put my disciplinary training and methodological approaches to work to improve the world around me, contribute something? That's where I feel I'm headed. So those are my anchors, if you will, in doing the work that I've done. I'd like to now discuss the 3 projects I hinted at before, talk about their birth, talk about the context, the way in which they relate to my own story, but also the way in which they exemplify different aspects of the ethnographer's toolkit and some of the theoretical and disciplinary issues that they have brought forth. So the first one is the project that ended up being my dissertation research on the very small island of Skyros, Greece. And this was a long time in coming. This project had its roots in my own life story, being a Greek American, being a halfie, someone who grew up in a hybrid culture. Aspects of Greek culture were very important for Greek Americans and their identity formation, particularly after the 1960s. And this, as I came to learn, was true of many ethnic groups that would be considered under the white umbrella in the United States, partly in response to some of the multicultural political efforts that came out of our civil rights struggle of the 1960s. Many white Americans began exploring their own European ethnic roots, and it became a way of strangely reinforcing their whiteness, if you will. And that was something that I discovered in my master's research on a Greek American folk dance troupe. And again, that was born out of my own personal involvement in my own community's Greek folk dance troupe, because we were playing at festivals where people would come to experience Greek culture. We would go out and dance for different civic organizations, children's schools, all of this kind of thing. It was very much a way of displaying ethnic identity, but within a larger context of white ethnicity in the United States. Within those performances of folk dance, I was always very aware of the performance of gender. There are many ways in which gender roles could be reinforced. And if you have any background in folklore or folk performance, this might be familiar to you, that oftentimes in dance, gender roles are codified. So you have folk costumes, you have particular dance moves that might be gendered. The man does this while the woman does this. And in our group, one way that was really reinforced was that if we didn't have enough men, there were a number of women who dressed up as men in order to preserve that gender balance, if you will. So I had long had this concern with the performance of gender and also the performance of authority. At what point, do you call yourself a dancer? Is that an identity that you can give yourself, or does the community ascribe that to you? And that carried over into the musical side. I've also been a singer and vocalist all my life, and I've also long struggled with, well, how do you claim this identity? Can you claim it for yourself? Do others bestow it on you? What is the relationship between yourself and your community? And how do you establish your, let's say, musical authority? So while I was doing my PhD research, when I started my PhD program, my intent was to go to Skiros. It's an island that is next to the island where my family comes from in Greece. So I had traveled there before. I knew that they had a very vibrant carnival tradition, like I showed you in the picture at the beginning. And I was prepared to go to Skiros and conduct dissertation research on dance, procession, kind of bodily movement, the way that people move through space in these public rituals, and thinking about the role of gender there. And that was indeed a very interesting topic. But as I was moving through my graduate coursework, I joined the University of Illinois Balkan Music Ensemble, and I began to sing the music of various Balkan countries, Greece, Turkey, Bulgaria, a number of others. And at the same time began to have an inkling that vocal music was in fact significant on Skiros. I did not know just how significant until I arrived on the island. So in case anyone of you is preparing an ethnographic project, just be assured you will not be able, no matter how much you try, to figure everything out about what your project will entail until you arrive in the field. That's part of the emergent process of fieldwork. Once I got to Skiros, I came to realize that they had a very precious a cappella, unaccompanied vocal tradition called table songs, tragudia tis tablas, that they would sing at festivals. And this photo is of some women singing at a festival. So religious festivals to celebrate a saint's feast day occur in these little tiny chapels out in the countryside all over the island. And next door to the chapel, they always have a feasting room. And after the religious service is done, people go to this room, they eat, they drink, and they sing. And some of the songs that they sing are considered to be endangered forms of culture. So there was a very prevalent worry on this island about these songs dying out because they weren't being transmitted to the next generation. And so gender was woven all through that because both women and men sang, but the stakes for them singing were different. When women sang, I found them to be very concerned about who heard them. And while I was in the field, it took me a long time before anybody would give me an interview or allow me to record them singing. And what I noticed women doing was taking me into the most interior room of their house, closing all the windows and doors and making sure nobody could overhear them singing to me. It was something very, very intimate. And at the same time, it was also tied to their sense of belonging to the island. So if you wanted to find out who knew a lot about music, people might say things like, well, so-and-so knows a lot of songs, but she's not really scary and she doesn't live here year round. So it was very interesting how often musical knowledge was tied to the sense of belonging to the island. So those were my concerns doing this research. And then in terms of methods, like I said, interviews and recording sessions became important, but they didn't come up until very near to my time of departure, because it took so long to develop the sense of comfort where people would open up to me. I spent a long time in participant observation, just living daily life on this island. I had my son with me at the time, who was 4.5. And so he took up a lot of my time. There was a lot of laundry. There was a lot of grocery shopping. There was a lot of cooking. There was a lot of everyday walking through the town, going to church, talking to people. I had wanted an apprenticeship, which is something that ethnomusicologists in particular like to pursue. Find someone who's a master in the musical technique that you would like to learn, and study with them as their student, as their disciple, depending on the tradition. And it turns out this was not something I could do on Skyros because of the way that they understood the relationship between their music and that sense of belonging to the island. I was an outsider. This was not, from their perspective, native anthropology at all. Even me being a halfie, a Greek American, didn't matter because I was not from Skyros. And so they flat out told me, our music cannot be taught. It has to be lived. And so the dilemma for them was, they weren't living their music in the presence of their children. A woman who was a very accomplished singer told me, my own children don't know these songs. We don't entertain this way anymore. In other words, we don't hold these feasts in our homes anymore, because that was how she had learned the songs. She wasn't doing that for her children anymore because the whole economy of the island had changed and they were engaged in tourism now. And so they didn't have the opportunities to learn the music. And while that was a concern for them, it didn't change the fact that I, as an outsider, was not the right kind of person to receive this knowledge. So I found myself unable to pursue that kind of apprenticeship there, or to engage in the sorts of performance where you have the opportunity to, let's say, sing for your teacher and find out how well you did. However, my inability to do those things also taught me a lot about precisely the way in which they valued this particular musical tradition of the table songs. They saw it as so intimate and so personal that there's no way it could be conveyed to an outsider. So I had a methodological roadblock that proved to be a very important discovery. My current project that I've been engaged in actively since 2013 is on Greek Orthodox liturgical chanting in Greek American churches, specifically here in the Midwestern United States, mostly in the Illinois area outside of Chicago. So this is to some extent a native anthropology project because I am a Greek Orthodox church member. I grew up singing liturgical music as a choir member. And along the way, at various churches that I belonged to, depending on where I lived at the time, had some level of informal and sporadic apprenticeships. And it became more formalized starting in 2013. This photo is of my son, Dimitri, who also chants with me. This is at our church in Champaign, Illinois. One of the interesting things about this concept of apprenticeship in chanting was that it was the one instance where I found a possibility of engaging in musical apprenticeship on Skyros. While I was speaking with singers, men would often tell me, well, I learned to sing by chanting. When I was young, someone told me I needed to go and start chanting in my church. And I worked alongside an older person, and he would point to things in the books and have me sing them. So they learned by doing. It was on the job training. So for men, that was a path to musical apprenticeship that was not open to women, because for a long time, the last couple of 100 years, it had not been traditional for women to chant in Greek Orthodox churches. This is changing both in Greece and in Greek American communities. But again, women's voices are more fraught than men's. There are still people who consider it improper for women to chant. It's not forbidden, but it's just seen as improper. Musically, the music that we chant was not created and is usually not performed with women's voices in mind. And in part, this has to do with the fact that at a church service, the priest is usually the one who starts the service. The priesthood in Greek Orthodox churches is always male, which means that a male voice starts almost all services and does so at his pitch. So from a very technical standpoint, these services don't have women's voices in mind. And this is a very concrete example of how gender and power can come together in musical performance. Because one of the things a woman chanter has to figure out is when and how to change the pitch to reach something that she can comfortably sing. And I've been engaged in those power struggles every Sunday. So the field work in this project was of much longer duration than my year-long dissertation research on Skyros. It was informed by a lifetime of performance of church music from the time that I was 14, and then a very long informal performance, apprenticeship with many opportunities for performance. Things really began to shift around 2018, 2019, when one of the chanters in our community became really too old and frail to do it. And so my son and I began to do it on a regular basis as a form of service to our community. So we were already in place, and I was already engaged in this apprenticeship, very much learning on the job when the pandemic hit. And for a time, our church was closed to physical participation. And so the only people in the building for a couple of months in 2020 were our priest and my son and myself. And we would broadcast over a live stream for people at home. And because they were trying to minimize the spread of respiratory particles, people who sometimes participated in choral singing were discouraged from doing so. And so as we're emerging out of the pandemic, although it's still going on, but we're in a different stage now and people have returned to participating in services in person, we have emerged, like it or not, as musical experts in our church. So we have ended up leading the singing at services where other people are present. Sometimes we still are the only people. And so at this point, I consider my project to be applied anthropology. That is, where you take your disciplinary knowledge and your methodological training and you apply it to solving problems in a community. And the problem in this community was they needed chanters. And so we filled that role. I recently became tonsured, which is a form of minor ordination that people who serve at the altar go through, or that people who serve as readers and chanters go through. The bishop comes and bestows this on you. It involves snipping some bits of hair off as a symbolic sacrifice. And it's a public ritual. So then you are bestowed with a new title. And I recently went through this, and it has sort of taken me from researcher to community practitioner, if you will, and my continued ongoing service comes out of really an ethical commitment. I started this project in order to learn more about what was the role and the power of women's voices in Greek Orthodox chant. Could a woman's voice have some sort of authority in this, let's face it, patriarchal religious denomination where all of the church hierarchy is male and where music is so important to the services, where most of the services are sung or intoned, but they don't have women's voices in mind? Well, it turns out women's voices can hold a lot of power, especially in a small community. So that's the good side. The difficult side is that then I must show up for every service and chant. And it's become very demanding. And so my continued involvement is part of my ethical commitment. Well, I can't stop just because I got the knowledge I wanted. Now I'm committed. Part of my ethics as a researcher demands that I continue to serve this community and train my replacement. So that's the stage I'm at with this project, which is that it has shifted to ongoing applied service and into a teaching role, you could say. Excuse me. The third area I want to talk about is a project that really has yet to be born. It's still being born. Again, from my personal autoethnographic perspective, I come from a long line of cooks. I come from a long line of gardeners. Greek people love to feed others. My grandparents gardened, my mother gardened. We've always been very intimately connected to feeding people, growing a certain portion of our food, and foodie culture, in quotes, has also grown tremendously in the last couple of decades. You can find so many shows about food on Netflix, not just cooking, not just cuisine, but also the historical and cultural roots of food. There are so many shows that we have been exposed to that many people consider themselves foodies. Many people have a growing interest in food from a lot of different perspectives. You combine that with inspiration that I've taken from some of my colleagues. I teach in a combined department of sociology and anthropology and criminology. And one of my sociology colleagues focuses on food insecurity and poverty in his research. And so I've been inspired by him and his local survey research on poverty and food insecurity among students on our campus. And so I began to feel inspired to put together a class on the anthropology of food. And I taught that for the first time in spring of 2019. And it brought me back to my early days as an undergraduate student, first learning about anthropology. The first time I took an anthropology class in the 1980s, I went to the bookstore to get my anthropology books. And I went into the anthropology section and was so overwhelmed and realized I wanted to read every book on the shelves. I actually started crying because I was so emotionally overwhelmed by how interested I was and how enthusiastic I was about this topic. Well, I went through a similar thing with food anthropology specifically. I couldn't and can't get enough of it. Everywhere I turn, I find articles and books related to some aspect of food, whether it's wealth inequality and people's differential access to food resources, whether it's climate change and sustainable agriculture, whether it's debates about human diet and nutrition. So I feel like this topic found me as much as I found it. It's a perfect coming together of my own personal interest. This upper left picture is a picture of refrigerator pickles that I recently made. So my refrigerator is filled with these pickles and I just have to get people to eat them up. The upper right picture is a portion of my gardens. I'm renting, so I garden in containers, and you can see I'm growing some lettuce there in these two containers. And then the bottom one is a picture from one of our local community gardens. And that's another interest as I'm looking around for places where I might do research sites that I might find. I've taken note of all the community gardens in my area. Some of them are called solidarity gardens. In other words, they're specifically aimed at addressing food insecurity in the community by growing food for people who are homeless, don't have the ability to grow food for themselves or the money to buy food for themselves. And there are a number of other community gardens and local growers who are committed to one degree or another to some of these issues. So these interests culminated in teaching the food class for the first time in 2019. I taught it again completely online in 2020, which was a challenge because we had planned a lot of live hands-on exercises. We made yogurt, we made butter, we looked at sourdough bread starter, we grew scrap gardens. We took the ends of lettuce or the ends of green onions and put them in water to grow new shoots. I had to change all of that over to an online version where students could do some of these in their homes if they wished. And what grew out of that class was a set of research posters that they gave at a virtual student conference on the ways in which food waste had changed during the pandemic. So some people talked about the increase of food waste. Some people talked about the increase of other kinds of waste in college dining, for example, where everybody was getting food to go in plastic or styrofoam containers. Other people talked about food insecurity and local food banks and how important they were during the pandemic. People talked about avoiding restaurants or going through drive-throughs. There were a lot of ways in which students were actively thinking about the ways in which food and eating and obtaining food and affording food were affected by the pandemic. On a personal level, during the pandemic, I also got involved with some local mutual aid groups where one of the things we did was to purchase and distribute food to people who were either quarantined because they had come down with COVID or were stuck at home for other reasons or were not able to provide food for themselves. And it was a very satisfying thing to do and actually reduced some of the anxiety I had in the very early days of the pandemic, because there was a time when I was afraid to go into the grocery store before we had any vaccines. It was very uncomfortable to go into the grocery store. I never felt afraid or uncomfortable to go and buy food for others, though. And that was a reminder to me that mutual aid can make you stronger as well as the community stronger. So at the moment, you could say I'm deeply involved in site selection, trying to figure out where will my project be located? Will it be the community garden aspect? Will it be the food insecurity aspect? I am spending a certain amount of time on social media groups and sites that have to do with food as well, that have to do with gardening, that have to do with sustainability, local people who garden and grow some of their food. And really, every time I leave the house, if I go to the farmer's market, if I go to the grocery store, If I cook a meal with friends, I'm never not thinking about this topic. So what I'm learning to do is let it breathe enough so that I can get a handle on what I want to do. Here's where we come into a little bit of luxury. I am at the stage where I can afford to take that time to let my project breathe and grow. I don't have the pressure of tenure because I've already gotten tenure. Yes, I'm looking forward to being promoted to full professor, but that lies with writing some more about my music research. This food project is the direction I would like to head in and stay in really for the rest of my career. I have the luxury of letting it slowly grow, like a garden plant, while I determine what would be the most impactful to the community around me, to my students, and to my own disciplinary interests. And I recognize that there is a certain amount of luxury in that. I'm not on a deadline. I don't have a thesis advisor encouraging me to hurry up and choose a topic and get started on research. Which leads me to my conclusion. This idea of ethnography from the inside out, connecting my personal story with my social and cultural context, and from there to my research, if this isn't done correctly, it can seem like a privileged indulgence. There's a certain amount of privilege just involved in being a scholar, obviously. There's also privilege involved in already being tenured, not to mention employed, and not at the student level where the pressures are different. However, what I think is important is that if we do it correctly, the insights that we can gain from incorporating our personal story and connecting that to the larger world could be better ethnography, more solidly grounded in the communities that surround us, and that could potentially lead to making the kinds of contributions that could matter to the world at large and could help others beyond the academy. And in that way could also address, from my perspective as an anthropologist, this colonial legacy, this sense of academic detachment from the cultural milieu in which we work and live. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Angela. So this is exactly that. This is exactly what we're after in each and every interaction that we have. That this is entirely different. This ethnography from inside out, starting off with how we can claim to be objective, or how knowledge is situated from what could be called a particular positionality. In this case, the Greek Orthodox spaces that you've been working with, into forays into autoethnography. Again, something very new for me. I have never been in that, and how we can relate to, because the POCOC kind of work on personal stories, how they develop into what was very interesting for me was the research topics, how they get pedagogically connected to personal stories, being a teacher, trying to do ethnography teaching. So that was the highlight of that part. And also, when I'm just reflecting on the talk, and what we do is we'll open the floor for the interaction. So what I will also simultaneously tell all our participants is to, you can type into the chat box, or if you wish to ask a question after my brief commentary, you can ask that as well. And so I was just also wondering about the civil rights kind of a political context, which reasserted the whiteness, as you say. I was also wondering whether it was also becoming a context for reflections as well, the other side on whiteness, and about the knowledge that is tied to the sense of belonging, in this case on a geological positioning in the island, and about the food aspect, the kinds of dimensions one can come to, even when you're like, for me, it's very, very special to see somebody working inside out and still coming to ideas which are like very abstract, like climate, class, nutrition kind of debates, which are basically theoretical for many of us. So all of these are intriguing, and there are many sides to your lecture, and I wish we'll have our interactions now, and afterwards there will be reflections from our ethnography students who have volunteered to reflect on this particular session. So great. Anybody who wish to ask a question, please come forward. They can ask in audio or chat as you wish, but try to keep it brief. Okay.
Okay, I see a question here on the chat. To what extent can we use digital ethnography? Is there any limit? Oh, that's a good question, and I didn't really touch on media in this presentation. I don't know if there's a limit. There's better ethnographers than I have been doing a lot with digital ethnography. I've had a productive interaction for the last several years with a sociologist in Chicago who does all kinds of media ethnography, and he's a filmmaker, and he's very committed to the idea that there are things you can do with a visual medium that you can't do as well in writing. And I know some other people that I've been talking to who feel like, it might be time to decenter writing from ethnography, because there's a lot of disciplinary politics associated with writing as well. And it tends to center, it tends to be a colonialist practice, and it tends to center whiteness, and there are class issues. And the discipline, my discipline, definitely privileges writing. You can see it in how people get tenure. A book tends to weigh more than an ethnographic film, for example. But digital ethnography is absolutely huge. I'll give you an example. I honestly, and I don't know that I have the skills to do this, but I think that scholars who are using something like Instagram to promote, their ideas and their theories, and just to highlight, small aspects of their ethnographic research, can be incredibly effective, because they can importantly get that information out to the public. It can break down that academic wall, and it can still be completely relevant. It can connect to larger pieces of writing. It can be linked to that. But yeah, there's a tremendous contribution that can be made by digital ethnography. And obviously for music, that's already multimedia, and audio media are important. I didn't include any audio samples in my presentation today because I have not always had great success in playing them over a virtual or an internet call format. They haven't always played well, but obviously audio and multimedia are incredibly important. Anything that has to do with the embodied senses. Writing is an abstraction, so there are ways in which digital ethnography can be much more immediate. I don't think that there is any limit to its potential. The limit comes from the institutions through which you may be trying to move as a scholar. That would be where the limitations come through. Do they respect digital ethnography? Does it carry the same weight as writing?
Okay. So thank you, Anasuya, for that question, which prompts a very interesting response from Angela. And let's take other queries. You can type in like Anasuya did, or you can also briefly pose your question.
Hello, ma'am.
Hello.
Can you please just reflect on how a church as a spiritual or cultural institution reflects on music or something like that?
Sure. So, in the tradition that I've been doing research in and that I'm part of in the community, I describe music as sonic theology. So, in this tradition, music is not just ornamental; it's theological. So the Greek Orthodox, the Byzantine musical tradition has a system of modes. There's 8 different modes, and you move through the church calendar. So every week is assigned to a different mode. So when you do the service that precedes the divine liturgy, or the mass, if you want to use that word, that service, a lot of the hymns will take that tone of the day, and then particular hymns are done in certain tones. So there's a very specific musicality. People are not just composing new hymns to any tune that they want. There's a very prescribed, way in which things should sound, and it's theological. It's meant to express certain spiritual ideas. It's meant to shape people's emotions in very particular ways. So I think folks in India can probably understand that a lot better. If you're not familiar with Greek Orthodox Christianity, you probably can understand this idea a lot better than, let's say, American evangelical Christians, who tend to compose new songs all the time, which sound a lot like popular music with religious lyrics. This is religious down to, every single note. So I think the modes that are used in church music might be more similar to the system of ragas, in that there's specific instances when you use them, and they have specific emotional colors to them, and they do certain things spiritually and emotionally to you, and they're meant to put you into the correct emotional and spiritual framework for worship. So that's part of the burden of this long apprenticeship, is you have to learn these modes, be able to sing them, and sometimes be able to improvise. Sometimes you'll have a text that is metered, so you know exactly what note to sing for each syllable. And other times you don't. You have a text. You just have a piece of text, and then you're supposed to sing it in mode 1. And so you have to figure out how to do that. So that's where a lot of the skill and the mastery come into it. But it's all within this framework that this isn't just free. It's not just anything goes there. It's the music is as theological as the words that are being sung. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you, ma'am. I
Thank you.
had one more query.
Yeah.
It was just when we think about spaces, how much the food culture can be, how we can trace the changes in a space through the changes in food culture.
Oh, space and food culture. Oh gosh. So many ways. Where do I even begin? One way I would say could be through food identity. Sometimes certain foods are identified with a place. particular place or a particular culture. So that's one way where, you know, the local culture can be understood through certain foods that are seen as, you know, kind of characteristic. If something happens to endanger that tradition, maybe the recipes aren't getting passed down. It's going to change a place. I'm thinking particularly too of places where the food culture is connected to tourism, where people visit that place to experience that food. So that could be one way if either the recipes are lost, so the tradition is lost, or the foods that are associated with the place are lost due to species extinction or climate change. So I see placemaking being very intimately tied to food in a lot of ways. And then, you know, one of the things, and I know that this is a Center for Urban Studies. So if I think about this little city I live in, Urbana, Illinois, with about 43,000 people, I think one of the reasons why so many local people and organizations are so interested in these community gardens and solidarity gardens and the farmers market here, which is a very thriving local farmers market, one of the things that they are concerned about is placemaking. How are people connecting? How are we enriching their sense of place rather than, let's say, the view from, you know, a couple of miles north where there's just a lot of asphalt roads leading to a big mall, and stores keep leaving the mall, restaurants keep closing. You know, that's a very dead sense of place. And so I think a lot of the people who are interested in building a more sustainable food culture definitely tie it to placemaking. Like, hey, we need to have places where people can go. Can they afford the food? Is food available? And how might that reflect their identity and their connection to their place?
Great. Angela, thank you, Tina, for the question. We have a question in the chat box by Julianne Thomas. What are the things that we should focus while doing an autoethnography?
Well, I don't know that I would advocate only doing autoethnography. I think we run the risk. I think for me, I'll tell you how I feel. I feel autoethnography is a thread that I'd like to weave throughout my ethnographic project. My intention when I got into anthropology was never only to do autoethnography. It was to include my own personal context as a way of enriching and grounding my research. Does that make sense? So to me, I think of autoethnography as an approach, something that should be incorporated. I know there are people out there who do autoethnography. You might get the idea from the presentation I gave today that I do autoethnography. I don't see myself as doing only autoethnography. I see myself as trying to include my own story in the larger story I'm telling in order to tell a more complete story and in order to make sure that I am including all of the relevant context. So I guess I see autoethnography as one part of a toolkit, but I have never tried only to do autoethnography. I always want to be reaching out to that wider context, because if I don't do that, then I don't know how useful or relevant my research is. But I'm not saying that to suggest that other people can't make it perfectly useful to just do an autoethnography. There have been many products like this, and in fact, in the references there, that Carolyn Ellis reference I mentioned, she basically is applying excuse me, my throat. She's applying the techniques of autoethnography to write what she calls a methodological novel. So she's trying to fictionalize her encounters with students in order to talk about ethnography. And so her whole book is really woven through with all kinds of personal information and personal life stories. So you could argue that she is doing an autoethnography, and not only that, but doing it in kind of in a fictionalized way. So it's perfectly possible. So what are the things you should focus on? I think context. Making sure that it's grounded in enough context that the reader could find themselves in the story, or find a larger society in the story. I think any good story about oneself, whether it's an autobiography or anything, should reveal context, because that's how you draw people into the story. I hope that answers your question.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie, for that question. We have a long question from Bijoy. Shall I read it for you, Angela?
Oh, no, I've got it.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I'll read it out loud.
Yeah.
So in India, we have modern day Eastern Orthodox Christians, including some who later embraced Roman Catholicism, on the earliest in the word. My question is, how does the life of Eastern Christians pan out in the United States in relation to a largely evangelical U.S. society? Are they syncretized well into the broader American culture? Do they still retain some puritanical elements? Okay, very interesting question. We are a still largely unknown and misunderstood religious minority. There was a group of evangelical Christians who in the 1980s went in search of what they called the Church of the New Testament. And through research, they discovered the Eastern Orthodox Church. So they joined en masse. There was just this huge influx of converts. They mostly joined the Antiochian church, which was the Syrian church. And many of them, really embraced the culture that they found there. A certain number of them tried to shift the culture that they found there. In other words, they brought that evangelical culture with them, which has been problematic. We are in a time period where there are a lot of tensions within many of the Eastern Orthodox communities in the United States, precisely because of the political leanings of many evangelical Christians in the United States, which from my perspective are highly toxic and definitely not Christian. Nationalistic, white supremacist, militaristic, misogynistic, you name it. I'm not a fan. And there are some folks who have mistaken Eastern Christianity because it's Orthodox, right? Where we describe ourselves as the original church, the church that the Catholics branched off of and all other Christians branched off of. Some people take that to mean that we're the most conservative of all the conservatives. And we are and we aren't. And so there's a real misunderstanding. And so my college age son is really experiencing this because he's meeting a lot of kids who are coming from other communities who may have grown up Orthodox, or they're discovering the church for the first time in college, and they're bringing a lot of this baggage with them. So it is a hot button political issue currently in the Eastern Orthodox churches in the United States. And I would say, unfortunately, and I can say this as a Greek Orthodox church member, it's particularly bad in the Greek Orthodox Church because Greek Americans already have tended to internalize a lot of these nationalistic and jingoistic ideas about culture because they bear this burden of being the birthplace of democracy, right? So they've already been put in this position of having some sort of special status in Western culture. Then you add to that maybe a sense of superiority, like, well, we're the best religion. So it's kind of it's a dangerous spot to be in, because people can join the church thinking that they're going to find this bastion of political conservatism, which is not actually the message of the church. And so there are a lot of arguments and discussions going on at different levels about how this gets done. So this question about are they syncretized well into the broader American culture, or do they retain some puritanical elements? Well, the concept of Puritanism comes from Protestants, and that they have definitely put their stamp on American culture. One of the things I've been interested in my musical research with Greek Orthodox liturgical music has been this very question of Greek Americans assimilating into mainstream United States culture. So earlier in the 20th century, the rise of church choirs that sang harmonized Western style arrangements of Byzantine hymns were very prevalent, and it was a place where women could easily join. It was a way for women to be of service in their church. It also helped the communities look more like other Christians in the United States. So they had a church choir, they wore choir robes, they sang harmonized Western music. Even if they were singing in Greek, it was a way of making themselves more legible to the culture around them. And then in the 1980s, 1990s, there was a Neo-Byzantine revival, and that started in Greece. After Greece joined the EU, they kind of went on a search for identity. Also, after the right-wing dictatorship ended at the end of the 70s, they went on this, kind of identity journey to rediscover the Eastern aspects of their culture, including music. And so there was a Byzantine revival. Well, let's really understand, the Byzantine roots of even our folk and popular music. So that was going on in Greece, and then that got imported over into the United States, and you could see a shift by the early 90s from an emphasis on that Western harmonized choral sound to a more traditional Byzantine sound, which would be a melody with a drone underneath. And so that kind of became politicized in a way, went through several different shifts. This is where gender for me is interesting, because traditionally those chanters would have been all male. But in the revival, there were also converts, including women, who were singing and chanting. But you could still have cultural clashes between these two groups, between what was now the old guard of choirs, and then this new, modern, ancient Byzantine kind of group. So it's been a very interesting shift, because those sounds come with cultural baggage. So when you hear the sounds, you might think that you're understanding something about the tension between tradition and modernity, between ideas about gender, but it's not always the way you think it's going to work out. So it comes out in religious life, it comes out in the way people interact with politics, and it does come out in the music. I hope that answers your question. It's a complex issue.
Thank you, Angela. That was a very interesting question from Bijoy, which opens up the whole domain. We have a question from Nikhil. Nikhil, please.
Good evening. Thank you, Dr. Glaros, for your presentation. So my question is connected to the criticisms of ethnography. Kind of like we don't really talk about that. So I think that's some issue people should be addressing, right? I mean, the way that mm, from your example, I clearly understood how you're both an insider and an outsider. The halfy position, and
Mhm.
it works well. But like in the context of India, we have these other deeper fissures, which are like caste and class, and it's really complicated. And
Yeah.
so 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 then somewhere down the line, we need, there is this issue with I am practicing ethnography, but I'm still like thinking twice about the methods, rigor in certain ways. And anyway, if the problem is that when I think of rigor, then is it like I'm attracted to the colonial idea of what anthropology is? But then somewhere down the line, to be objective, or I don't know, because getting something published is a difficult thing. And
Oh,
uh,
yes.
so like I said, maybe I'm trying to write like a white man, and my research might be tending towards that. So I was very interested in your take on these two issues, because one is the criticism, and this struggles an anthropologist have to make while writing about their culture, other culture, or the culture which is in front of them. Like in my case, I'm studying a city which is close to where I am. So
Mhm.
I am sort of an insider and outsider. So,
Yeah.
but maybe you could give me some insights on that. Thank
Well,
you.
you raise really important points. Thank you for this question. I think that the things you're talking about are the reasons why I included some of the sources I did, because they're trying to get at this fact that, first of all, to call someone a native anthropologist is itself a colonialist move, because, like as you said, there are so many close grained differences. If I'm in a community, if I do native anthropology here in Urbana, Illinois, what if I go and work with African Americans? I'm not an African American, Our city is sadly quite segregated. So that would be an example. And as you say, the issues of caste and class. And yeah, the danger of kind of replicating some of those power inequities would be a problem. I wonder to what extent you can do any kind of collaborative ethnography, because that's another strategy that people are using to try to bring in the community, not just through interviews or through, inclusion or consent forms, but in the design of the research. In other words, going to the community and saying, the city that you want to work in, residents, maybe find out what is it you think the city needs? What is it that you think we should be researching? To the extent that you can do collaborative research with them, that can really change the power dynamic. But as you said, then the issue comes, how are you going to manage co-authorship when it comes to publishing? I can send everybody a resource for this. Here in the States, Luke Eric Lassiter is an anthropologist who's literally written a handbook on collaborative ethnography. He's a really interesting researcher. He did dissertation research on music. He worked with Native American Kiowa people and talking about Kiowa song, but he's also done some collaborative projects. There was a project called The Other Side of Middletown, which was about, I think Middletown was really Muncie, Indiana. So there was an early qualitative study done on Muncie, Indiana, that pretty much left out the Black community. So they tried to tell the story of the city, but didn't address, a huge percentage of the residents. So he and a team went in and did some collaborative ethnography with the African American community, specifically to talk about their contributions to this city. So the idea of collaborative anthropology is one way in which people are trying to get away from that sort of, you know, anthropologist other dynamic, and to try to start with, you know, hi, I'm a researcher. I have these skills. What in your community would you like to know, and how do you want to work with us? It's not always feasible, but it's another approach that you know, perhaps you have the ability to consider. I guess it would really depend on, you know, your resources and your program and your institution, etc.
Thank you. Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Nikhil, for that question. If Angela is okay, can we take three or four more questions, if it's brief?
Sure.
Okay. So let me invite other queries as well. You can ask in the audio, or you can type in. Can I pause? I mean, I had something that came to my mind when you were talking about the food ethnography aspect.
Yes.
Because I mean, this is a completely different methodology that you're talking about. I mean, seeing food from inside out, and seeing it in context as I saw it. Whether that's a pandemic context, or whether that's a kind of community kitchen running, or whether that's a type of gardening which is conscious about certain health aspects. And as you self-reflexively imagine this, it's a great. I mean, it's about seeing it from your own positionality. But isn't there also another kind of an ethnography which which is probably I mean, all of you know this, that classic Sydney Mints kind of a thing, in which you really, if you go tracing that food, I mean, nowadays it will be very difficult, because like I was about to ask when you were talking about the Greek liturgy, and even the Norman names that you find in different parts of the world, they crisscross a lot in a globalizing time. So does the food. So does digitally available YouTube videos of food making. But despite all that, is there a potential of tracing like a substance through its history, the way it has moved across places, like Mince has done with sugar?
Yes.
I mean,
Exactly.
being at times becoming an elite matter, and then becoming a common ingredient. Is there a scope for that kind of a work in this globalized kind of a time?
Oh, absolutely. And I think there's a number of people doing things that you might consider kind of a crossover between food history and ethnography. Yeah, Sydney Mintz, that is the classic book. I'm also thinking, and he's not an anthropologist, but Michael Pollan, Pollan, is a journalist who became very interested in food and has written a number of books. He wrote a book called The Omnivore's Dilemma. He wrote another book called The Botany of Desire. And in that one, he does focus on, I think, 4 different plants that have really changed kind of, you know, the world and human life. Like the apple, I forget the other ones, but, you know, and he's bringing in a number of you know, historical references. I don't know how much on the ground research he does in that book, but I know in The Omnivore's Dilemma, it's somewhere between journalistic research and ethnography. He, you know, goes to a place where they're, you know, extracting salt from the sea. He goes to a farm where they're using biodynamic techniques to kind of, you know, close the circle of food waste and environmental kind of degradation. So he's got a combination of historical references in his research, and then his, you know, on the ground experiential research. So yeah, there are people doing that. it's such a big project. I tend to think of very small projects. I tend to start very, very locally, but yeah, obviously a very far reaching and ambitious thing a person could do would be pick an ingredient and follow it and see the way it plays a role in different cuisines, how it got there, the trade routes by which it got there, the politics involved in that ingredient. That's fascinating research, and it's interdisciplinary research too, which is important. I may not be doing it, but that doesn't mean others can't.
Great. Thank you for those insights. I mean, Michael Pollan, right? I've noted
Yeah.
that name. Because, I mean, now the only other name that comes to my mind was Jack Moody, who was talking about Western food traditions and and interlinking that with love in his book. Because I was reminded of an interview which I happened to read that you had. I mean, was it an interview or an article? I forget, in which, in a context, in an ethnographic context, somebody is asking you whether you have been in love.
Yeah, that was
like
on
that, right?
Spiros. That was
Yeah.
on Spiros. That was that was her checking on my qualifications to learn
Okay.
about music.
Okay. All right. So, are there any other queries? Okay. If there are no more queries, either in the audio or the chat mode, I shall ask a couple of our students in the ethnography program, who've been always enthusiastic about every program that we run, to come forward and reflect on Angela's talk, if that is fine. So, shall I invite? Is it? It's good to see you, Angela. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't realize my camera was off. I'm so sorry.
Oh yeah, I was yeah, I was about to ask, but before that you turned it on.
Sorry.
I mean, keeping the cameras on is fine for everyone. Okay, it's just about the mic that I was talking about. It's the mic is the interfering part. It's good that your cameras are on. And let me invite a couple of our students to reflect on today's lecture, if possible.
So good evening, all. I think it was a very wonderful session, ma'am. It was a very enlightening session. It gave us insights about a lot of things. As a beginner in ethnography, I think your session actually introduced me to different authors and many books and many fields of ethnography. And you talked about the ways, the inside up. Outsider approach. When you talked about it, I could understand the problems. You talked about the problems of representation and the way we could approach a research. So, and thank you, ma'am, for answering patiently all our queries. Thank you so much. And I would also like to thank Mathew, sir, for arranging us such sessions. Thank you.
Thank you, Anasuya. Is there anyone else who wish to reflect on today's lecture? Yeah, Tina.
Hi, ma'am. For me, it was like a journey, or it was like a travel through different aspects. And what to say, you introduced it about dance, music, and I was always interested about the topic itself. And your talk really reflected on the collective self and how should we understand a collective self from a really different perspective. And it's like how should we incorporate our real identity as a person living in the society and as a scholar, and how to uh, put it together in our work. And it was a wonderful session. And so many topics we talk about, like when even it is food and dance or music, we concerned about gender and how it connected with society and how the hierarchy works and how institutions work. And for me, it's like today's session was like a eye opener to so many, or like it's a window pan, like which give me different views. So thank you for your valuable time, and also for Mathew sir. Thank you for arranging such a wonderful session. Thank you.
Thanks, Tina. It's also happy that a few of our like comrades in scholarship, like from my ex-university, Stella, and many others like Soma, Sepoy, and anthropologists. Many people have joined. I don't want to name all, but I saw many names before as well. Some of them have left. So anybody could reflect on this, and then we'll close the session. Oh, thank you. Vijay is saying that being an IR student, I got a different perspective when it's spoken by someone from a related discipline.
Thank you for that. I forgot to mention, I did an undergraduate degree in international relations. I probably should have mentioned that at some point.
Oh, okay.
That's how I got into anthropology.
So, so there is scope for detours. So yeah, and now I think if there is anyone else who wishes to say a word, otherwise I will conclude formally. But you know, the thing is, this forum will be live, and what we wish is to have people like Angela, you know, who happily agree to join these forums to keep coming, and every discussions we have, we'll also share with you, and please contribute as both as a presenter and participant in further meetings as well. And there are many things I take home from this talk, starting from the pedagogical aspect, but also beyond autoethnography. I was also interested in the collaborative ethnography scope, because you know that addresses probably many things as in the intersections that different ethnographies can come to in a collaborative work. A lot of scope there, probably that has to be explored a lot more methodologically as well. So many things. So once again, I wish to express my happiness to Angela and to all our enthusiastic participants. And please be with us, all of you, in the coming events as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Bob. So good night, good evening, good morning, as the case may be. Yeah. Hi, Sabah. How are you?